Your mind already knows how to find problems. It does it without effort, without instruction, without any practice at all. What your mind was never trained to do is think clearly once it finds one. That is what this audiobook is about. There is a particular kind of tiredness that sleep doesn't fix. You wake up and it's already there. A low hum, a quiet tension you can't quite locate. You move through your morning, the coffee, the routine, the familiar sequence of small tasks. And somewhere beneath all of it, your mind is already working, already scanning, already preparing for something that hasn't happened yet. This is not laziness. It is not weakness. It is not a character flaw you need to overcome with more discipline or a better morning routine. It is a mind that never learned how to stop finding problems and never learned what to do once it found one. And the strange thing, the thing most people never realize, is that this kind of exhaustion has very little to do with how much you actually have to deal with. People with genuinely difficult lives sometimes carry a quiet steadiness that others with far easier circumstances don't. The difference is rarely about circumstances. It is almost always about the relationship between a person and their own thinking. Your problems are not exhausting you. Your mind's relationship with your problems is exhausting you. That distinction sounds small. It isn't. Most of us were never taught how to think clearly. We were taught what to think: facts, subjects, opinions, beliefs. But the actual movement of the mind when it meets a problem, the way it loops, the way it fixates, the way it returns to the same fear wearing slightly different clothes. No one sat us down and explained any of that. So we inherited patterns, ways of meeting uncertainty, ways of holding problems inside the mind, turning them over and over, examining them from every angle, searching for the one thought that would finally make them feel resolved. Here is what no one told you about that process. It rarely works. Not because you aren't intelligent, not because you aren't trying hard enough, but because the kind of thinking most people do when they're anxious isn't actually problem solving. It is the mind's attempt to feel safe by staying busy, to manage uncertainty by never stopping, to control what might happen by preparing for everything. Finding problems is effortless. Your mind does that automatically, instinctively, without being asked. Thinking clearly once you've found one, that is the skill no one taught you. Overthinking is not analysis. It is what happens when a mind trained to find problems has no trained response for what comes next. So it keeps looking, keeps scanning, mistakes movement for progress. The mind convinces you it is working. It presents itself as diligent, responsible, thorough. But if you step back, if you honestly look at what that thinking is actually producing, you will often find the same thoughts cycling through again. The same fears, the same what-ifs, the same unresolved scenarios, slightly rearranged. That is not thinking clearly. That is a mind doing the only thing it knows, finding more problems inside the one it already has. A tired mind does not think clearly, and a mind that never stops searching is always tired. Here is something worth sitting with quietly. The mental exhaustion you feel is not the result of having too many problems. It is the result of what your mind does with them. In the gaps between tasks, in the quiet moments, in the spaces where nothing is actually happening but your mind refuses to believe that. Think about the last time you felt genuinely, completely at rest. Not just physically still, but mentally quiet. When was that? For many people, the honest answer is, not recently. Or, only when I was completely distracted. Or, only when I was too tired to think anymore. This is the pattern, and it runs deeper than stress or busyness. It runs into a simple asymmetry in how the mind was built. Finding problems, fast, automatic, effortless. Thinking clearly about them, slow, trained, deliberate. One comes naturally, the other has to be learned. And for most people, only one half of that equation ever receives any attention at all. When something is unresolved, the mind flags it, keeps it active, returns to it. This is not irrational. A human being who stopped thinking about unresolved threats did not survive as reliably as one who kept them front of mind. But we no longer live in that world. The threats your mind is preparing for are almost never physical. They are social, financial, relational, professional. They are about what someone thinks of you, what might happen in 6 months, what that message meant, whether you made the right decision, whether you are doing enough, being enough, living correctly. These are real concerns. They deserve real thought, but they do not deserve the continuous, low-grade emergency your nervous system assigns to them. And they will never be resolved by a mind that only knows how to find more layers of the problem. Urgency is not always truth. The feeling that something must be thought about right now, that familiar mental pressure, is often the nervous system reacting, not reality demanding. That emergency response costs something. It costs energy. It costs clarity. It costs the very capacity you need to actually think your way through what you're facing. Here is the precise irony. The more urgently you think about your problems, the less capable you become of thinking clearly about them. Calm is not the absence of problems. Calm is the state from which problems can actually be solved. This audiobook is not about positive thinking. It is not about convincing yourself that everything will be fine. It is not about suppressing what you feel or pretending difficulty doesn't exist. It is about learning to meet your problems from a different mental place. One that is grounded instead of reactive, deliberate instead of frantic, clear instead of noise-filled. That place is trainable. The exhaustion you have been carrying is not evidence that your life is too hard. It is evidence that your mind has been working in a way that was never designed to bring you relief. That can change, not because your problems will disappear, but because the mind that meets them will be different. In the next section, you will begin to understand why the nervous system treats uncertainty as danger, and why that ancient response, though well-intentioned, is the very thing making it so difficult to think clearly in the life you are actually living. Section 2. Why your nervous system mistakes uncertainty for danger. Before you had language, you had a nervous system. Before you could reason through a situation, weigh your options, or reflect on what something meant, you had a body that already knew, instantly and automatically, whether something was safe or not. That system is still running. Right now, as you listen, a part of your brain is doing what it has always done: scanning, assessing, categorizing everything in your environment and everything in your thoughts as either safe or threatening. It does this without your permission, without your awareness, without any input from the part of you that can think, reflect, or reason. And here is where things become complicated. That system was built for a world that no longer exists. Imagine what uncertainty meant to a human being thousands of years ago, not knowing where the next meal would come from, not knowing whether the sound in the darkness was wind or something dangerous, not knowing whether the people you depended on for survival would still be there tomorrow. In that world, uncertainty was not an abstract feeling. It was a direct signal of physical danger, and a nervous system that learned to treat it seriously, that mobilized the body the moment something was unresolved, that kept attention sharp and alertness high. That nervous system kept people alive. It was not a flaw. It was a feature. The problem is that you are not living in that world. You are living in a world where uncertainty looks completely different. The unresolved things in your life are not predators or food shortages. They are unanswered messages, financial pressures, relationship tensions, professional uncertainty. The quiet, persistent question of whether you are doing enough, being enough, living correctly. None of these things will hurt you in the next 30 seconds. But your nervous system does not know that. So it treats them the same way it would treat a predator, with the same alertness, the same mobilization, the same refusal to stand down until the threat is resolved. And most of these things never fully resolve, so the alertness never fully turns off. When the brain detects something unresolved, a cascade begins. Stress hormones rise. Attention narrows. The body prepares for action. And then, because the threat is not something you can physically respond to, that activation has nowhere to go. So it stays. It becomes the hum, the background tension, the low-grade alertness that follows you through your day, draining energy from every hour even when nothing particularly difficult is actually happening. Your nervous system is not malfunctioning. It is doing precisely what it was designed to do. It simply was not designed for this. The nervous system reacts before logic arrives. And in the gap between the reaction and the reasoning, all of that energy is already being spent. Uncertainty is a particular kind of trigger because it never fully closes. Physical danger, at least, has a resolution. The threat passes or it doesn't. The nervous system activates, you respond, and then, if you survive, the system returns to rest. Uncertainty stays open, and an open threat to the nervous system is an ongoing threat. So the scanning continues. The mind keeps returning to the unresolved thing, not because you are weak or anxious by nature, but because the system responsible for your safety refuses to stand down until the danger closes. This is why you lie awake at 3 in the morning thinking about a conversation that happened days ago. Not because the conversation matters that much, but because something about it remains unresolved, a question of what it meant, what the other person thinks, whether something needs to be addressed, and your nervous system has flagged that open loop as a potential threat. It is not irrational. It is ancient, and it is costing you far more than you realize. Here is what changes everything. The nervous system is not fixed. It is not a static system running the same program forever, unchangeable and beyond your influence. It learns. It adapts. It responds to repeated experience. The calm you observe in certain people, those who seem to hold uncertainty without being consumed by it, who can sit with unresolved situations without their minds going into emergency mode. That calm is not a personality trait they were born with. It is a trained response. A nervous system that has learned, gradually and through repeated experience, that uncertainty does not always mean danger. That not knowing how something will unfold does not require continuous preparation for the worst. That the absence of resolution is not the same as the presence of threat. That training is possible for you, not through forcing yourself to feel calm, which almost never works, because it addresses the thought without addressing the system producing the thought, but through something more fundamental, a slow, consistent change in the relationship between your nervous system and the experience of not knowing. Solution-focused thinking is part of that training. When the mind has a practiced orientation toward what can be done, even something small, even something imperfect, the nervous system receives a different signal. Not false reassurance, not manufactured optimism, genuine information. There is a direction. There is a response available. This is not a dead end. That signal, quiet as it sounds, begins to change the calculation. Uncertainty stops reading as danger quite so automatically. The activation becomes less reflexive. The hum quiets, not all at once, not overnight, but measurably, over time, with practice. You were not born anxious. You were not born with a nervous system that overreacts to uncertainty. You were born with a nervous system doing its job, calibrated for a world your ancestors lived in, not the one you are navigating now. That is not your fault, but it is something you can work with. And understanding it, truly understanding it, at a level deeper than intellectual, is where that work begins. Understanding changes the relationship. When you feel that hum, that background tension with no clear source, you can begin to recognize it for what it actually is. Not evidence that something is wrong, not proof that your situation is genuinely dangerous. An ancient system doing an ancient job in a world it was not built for. That recognition, small as it seems, is the beginning of something larger. In the next section, you will begin to see what that constant activation is actually costing you. Not in abstract terms, but in the specific, felt ways that thinking in circles drains the mental resources you need to think clearly, decide well, and live without the weight of thoughts that were never meant to stay this long. Section 3. The emotional cost of thinking in circles. There is a thought you have had before, not once, not twice, many times, so many that you have stopped counting, stopped noticing, stopped recognizing it as the same thought returning again. It feels each time like you are finally addressing it, finally sitting down with it seriously, finally going to work it through. And then, somewhere in the middle of that process, you realize you are exactly where you started. Same fear, same question, same unresolved weight sitting in the same place. This is not a thinking problem. It is not an intelligence problem. It is what happens when a mind trained to find and hold problems has no clear pathway out of them. The thinking circles back, not because you are doing something wrong, but because the mind was never given a direction to move toward. So it moves in the only shape available to it. A loop. There is a word for this. rumination. The image it suggests is useful, the same material, returned to again and again, processed repeatedly. It feels like work. It presents itself as serious engagement with a difficult situation. It mimics the quality of deep thought. But here is where the image breaks down. The output is not clarity. It is not resolution. It is not even a better understanding of the situation. The output is more thinking, more angles, more layers of worry placed carefully on top of the ones already there. Rumination is not problem solving. It is fear dressed in the clothes of analysis. A tired mind does not think clearly, and rumination keeps the mind tired, by design, without end, until something interrupts it from the outside. Here is what this costs you, specifically, in ways that touch every corner of your life. The first cost is focus. Your mind has a limited capacity for clear, sustained thought at any given moment. This is not a metaphor. It is simply true. When a portion of that capacity is continuously occupied by a circling thought, a worry that never resolves, a loop that keeps returning, that portion is unavailable for everything else. You are thinking about the problem while talking to someone you love. You are replaying a conversation while trying to work. You are physically present and mentally somewhere else entirely. This is why emotional stress affects performance across the board, not just in the area where the stress originates. The loop doesn't stay contained. It bleeds into everything. It makes ordinary tasks feel harder than they are. It makes conversations feel more effortful. It makes the day feel longer, heavier, more draining than the actual events within it would warrant. The second cost is decision quality. Clear decisions require a certain spaciousness, the ability to hold multiple options, consider consequences, and arrive at a choice that reflects what you actually want rather than what your current emotional state is demanding in the moment. Loops destroy that spaciousness. When the mind is occupied with circling thoughts, decisions don't get made from clarity. They get made from exhaustion, from the desperate need to resolve the tension, to stop the loop, to feel something settle, even temporarily, even imperfectly. This is why people under chronic mental pressure make decisions they later can't explain. Not because they are impulsive by nature, but because the part of the mind that produces careful, considered decisions was running on almost nothing. You cannot think clearly through a problem from inside a loop. The loop itself distorts everything. Every option looks different from inside anxiety than it would from inside calm. Every risk looks larger. Every path forward looks less certain than it actually is. The problem hasn't changed, but your capacity to see it clearly has been compromised by the state you are viewing it from. The third cost is the quietest and the most persistent. It is the feeling of never being finished. When thinking circles, nothing ever fully resolves. Problems don't close. They pause briefly and then reopen. The mind returns to them in quiet moments, in transitions between tasks, in the space between waking and sleeping. There is always something pending, always something unresolved, always a low-grade sense that something needs to be figured out. This is an exhausting way to live. Not dramatically exhausting, not in a way that gets easily acknowledged. Quietly exhausting. The kind of tiredness that accumulates slowly and announces itself only when you realize you can't remember the last time your mind felt genuinely at rest. You may have called this your personality, told yourself you are a worrier, an overthinker, someone who just takes things more seriously than most. You may have made peace with it, woven it into your sense of who you are. But it is not who you are. It is a pattern your mind learned. And patterns that were learned can be unlearned. The exit from the loop is not willpower. Telling yourself to stop thinking about something is one of the least effective strategies available. The more deliberately you try to push a thought away, the more present it becomes. Suppression doesn't empty the loop. It pressurizes it. The exit is not distraction, either. Distraction interrupts the loop temporarily, which is sometimes necessary, sometimes genuinely useful. But the loop resumes the moment the distraction ends, often with more force than before. The exit is direction. When the mind has somewhere genuine to go, a small, honest orientation toward what is possible, what is within reach, what the next real step looks like, the loop loses its grip. Not because the problem disappears, but because the mind is no longer circling a threat with no exit. It is moving, even slowly, even imperfectly, and a mind that is moving, even slightly, even tentatively, is a fundamentally different psychological experience than a mind spinning in place. This is the foundation of everything that follows in this audiobook. Not a technique, not a trick, a direction. In the next section, you will encounter what solution-focused thinking actually means, not the surface-level version, but the real psychological discipline behind it. The one that changes not what you think about, but how your mind moves when it meets difficulty. Section 4. What solution-focused thinking actually means. Let's be honest about something first. The phrase solution-focused has a problem. It sounds like self-help. It sounds like the kind of thing printed on a motivational poster. Cheerful, surface level, slightly irritating. It sounds like someone is about to tell you to stop dwelling and start doing. To look on the bright side. To channel your energy into solutions instead of problems. If that is what you are expecting, you are about to be surprised. Because solution-focused thinking, in its real psychological form, has almost nothing to do with any of that. The term comes not from productivity culture, but from clinical psychology, developed in the 1980s by therapists working with people navigating serious life difficulties. Depression, addiction, family breakdown, trauma. These were not people who needed to be told to think positively. They needed something more precise than that. Something that worked at the level of how the mind actually moves when it is under stress, not how we wish it would move. What those therapists discovered was this. Spending most of the therapeutic time analyzing the problem in depth rarely produced the fastest or most lasting change. What produced change was a subtle but powerful shift in where the mind directed its attention, away from the detailed architecture of what was wrong, and toward the smallest available evidence of what was possible. Not ignoring the problem, not pretending it didn't exist. Simply turning, at least partially, toward what could be engaged with. That shift sounds small. Its effects, over time, are not. Here is the distinction that matters most. Problem-focused thinking asks, what is wrong? Why is it wrong? And who or what is responsible? These are not always bad questions. Sometimes they are exactly the right questions. Understanding the source of a problem can be genuinely important. In medicine, in practical situations, in any domain where root cause determines correct response. But in the lived experience of navigating your own mind, in the daily friction of uncertainty, difficulty, and unresolved things, problem-focused thinking has one serious limitation. It feeds the loop. Every time the mind goes deeper into what is wrong, it generates more for the emotional system to process. More detail means more threat signals. More threat signals mean more activation. More activation means narrower thinking, which means the analysis becomes less accurate, not more, the deeper it goes. This is why people who spend hours analyzing their problems often feel worse than when they started. Not better informed, not closer to resolution, more overwhelmed, more certain the situation is serious, more convinced that the path forward is unclear. The analysis wasn't wrong. The direction of the analysis was wrong. Solution-focused thinking asks a different set of questions. Not what is wrong and why, but what is already working, even slightly? What has helped before, even a little? What would one small step forward look like? Not the complete solution, just the next honest movement. These questions do something different in the mind. They point the mind's attention toward evidence of possibility rather than evidence of threat. And because the mind finds what it searches for, because attention is not a passive receiver but an active filter, the quality of what it returns begins to change. This is not magical thinking. It is not the law of attraction repackaged. It is a straightforward consequence of how attention works. The mind cannot hold equal focus on two opposing directions simultaneously. When it is genuinely oriented toward what is possible, it is, by definition, less oriented toward what is threatening. The emotional system receives a different signal. The nervous system begins, gradually, to ease its grip. Clarity becomes available again. It is worth being precise about what solution-focused thinking is not asking you to do. It is not asking you to feel optimistic before you have reason to. It is not asking you to minimize what is hard, or to perform a positivity you don't feel, or to skip the honest acknowledgement of how difficult something actually is. It is asking something far more modest and far more powerful. It is asking you to spend a portion of your mental energy facing a direction where movement is possible. Not all of your energy, not in denial of what is real, simply a trained habit of turning, at least partially, toward what can be engaged with. Even in genuinely difficult circumstances, there is almost always something within reach. A small action, a piece of information that could be gathered, a conversation that could be had, a decision that could be made, even imperfectly. Calm is not weakness. It is access. Access to the part of the mind that can actually find these things. Solution-focused thinking trains the mind to look for them, not because they solve everything, but because engaging with them changes the mental state from which you face everything else. A mind that has taken one small step forward is neurologically different from a mind that has been circling in place. The noise is lower. The thinking is clearer. The next step becomes more visible. This is how momentum is built. Not through motivation, not through willpower, but through the compounding effect of small directional movements on a nervous system that gradually learns. There is always somewhere to go. You are not being asked to become an optimist. You are being asked to become a navigator. Optimists believe everything will work out. Navigators don't know whether it will, but they know their current position, they know the direction they want to move, and they know the next step available to them right now. That is solution-focused thinking, not a feeling, not a personality type you either have or don't. A practiced direction, one that can be trained, refined, and eventually made automatic in the moments that used to send your mind into spirals. Your mind already knows how to find problems. It has always known that. What it is learning, here, slowly, deliberately, is where to go once it finds one. In the next section, you will encounter something that may feel uncomfortable at first. The idea that the mind does not stumble into loops by accident. That there is a pull toward them. Something that functions, quietly, like an addiction. And understanding that pull is the first step toward releasing it. Section 5. The addiction to problems. This is the section most people don't expect. Not because the idea is complicated, but because it names something most people have felt and never quite allowed themselves to look at directly. The idea is this: your mind does not stumble into problem-focused loops by accident. It is not simply failing to find the exit. There is something pulling it back. Something that makes the familiar weight of a recurring problem feel, in a quiet and subtle way, safer than the unfamiliar lightness of moving past it. Something that functions, in its own gentle way, like an addiction. The word carries a lot of weight. It conjures dramatic images. That is not what is being described here. What is being described is something more ordinary, and precisely because it is ordinary, more pervasive. The brain is, at its core, a pattern recognition system. Its primary function is to match incoming experience against what it already knows, and to generate a response based on what has worked before. This is enormously efficient. It is also the source of something most people never examine. Familiar experiences feel safer than unfamiliar ones, even when the familiar experience is painful. A known difficulty has a known shape. The mind understands its contours, knows roughly how long it lasts, knows what it feels like to move through it. An unknown future, even a potentially better one, has no such map. And the nervous system, as you now know, treats the unknown as a potential threat. So it pulls back, returns to what it recognizes, circles the familiar problem one more time. Not because the problem is comfortable, but because the mind knows this territory. The problem has become a kind of home. There is a second layer, and this one requires a little more honesty. Problems are not just neurologically familiar. For many people, they are also part of how they understand themselves. Think about the language you use in difficult moments, the stories you tell to others, and more importantly, to yourself. There is often, buried inside those stories, a self that is defined in significant part by what it is struggling with. Someone who carries a lot, someone who has been through things, someone who feels things deeply, perhaps more deeply than others. None of this is false. The experiences are real. The feelings are real. The depth is real. But somewhere in the accumulation of those experiences, the mind begins to confuse the struggle with the self, begins to treat the problem not as something happening to you, but as something that is you, a fundamental part of your identity rather than a feature of your current circumstances. And here is the difficult truth that follows. If the problem is your identity, then moving past it can feel, quietly, below the surface, like losing something. Not consciously, not in a way you would ever articulate out loud, but in the quiet arithmetic of the nervous system. Releasing a long-held problem can feel like releasing a part of yourself you have been carrying for a long time. Identity is not fixed, but it is deeply familiar, and familiarity, to the nervous system, feels like safety. This is why insight alone rarely produces lasting change. People can understand, with perfect clarity, that a pattern of thinking is harming them, and still return to it by the end of the day. They can see the loop from the outside, name it accurately, agree completely that it is not serving them, and find themselves back inside it within hours. This is not weakness. It is not a failure of understanding. It is the identity pull, the gravitational force of a self that has organized itself, at least partially, around a particular problem or way of suffering. The solution is not to fight that pull directly. Fighting it activates the same dynamic that makes not thinking about something impossible. The harder you push against it, the more present it becomes. The solution is to build a different identity alongside it. Gradually, quietly, through small, repeated experiences of being someone who moves, even slightly, even imperfectly, toward clarity rather than deeper into the problem. Each time the mind is gently redirected. Each time a small step is taken instead of another loop completed. Each time regulation comes before reaction. These moments don't feel significant. They feel like small choices in ordinary moments, almost too small to count. But the mind is counting. Somewhere below awareness, a different pattern is being laid down. A different answer forming, slowly, to the question the mind is always quietly asking. Who am I when things get difficult? Not someone defined by problems. Someone who knows how to move through them. There is one more dimension worth naming, perhaps the most quietly pervasive of all. Problems are socially visible. When you are struggling, people understand. There is a language for it, a framework others recognize. Struggle communicates something. It generates empathy, connection, a clear position in the social world. Calm clarity, by contrast, is nearly invisible. A person who has quietly regulated themselves, who approaches difficulty without drama, whose internal work leaves no outward trace. That person often goes unnoticed. The effort is real, but it doesn't announce itself. This is not a reason to stay in the loop, but it is worth acknowledging honestly, because the social pull toward visible struggle is real, and pretending it isn't makes it harder to navigate. You are not weak for holding the problem this long. You are doing what minds do, finding familiarity, maintaining identity, staying legible to the world around you. But you are capable of something quieter and more durable than that. And the fact that you are still listening is its own kind of evidence. In the next section, you will begin to understand the mechanism that makes clear thinking so difficult in the moments that matter most. The way emotional activation narrows the mind precisely when it most needs to be wide open. Section 6. How emotional reactions distort clear thinking. There is a moment you have had many times. 1 second you are thinking clearly. The next, something shifts. A message arrives. A tone of voice registers. A plan falls apart in a way you didn't anticipate. And the thinking that was available to you a moment ago, the spacious, considered, relatively clear thinking, is simply gone. In its place is something faster, louder, more certain of itself than it has any right to be. Something that presents its conclusions with the confidence of careful reasoning, while bypassing careful reasoning entirely. This is not a character flaw. It is not a sign that you are too emotional, too sensitive, too reactive. It is something that happens to every human mind, in every culture, at every level of intelligence and self-awareness. Understanding it doesn't prevent it entirely, but understanding it changes everything about what you do next. The mechanics begin before you are aware of them. When the brain detects something it reads as threatening, and as you now know, that category is far broader than actual physical danger, a cascade begins. The brain's threat detection center fires. Stress hormones are released. Attention narrows sharply onto the perceived threat. All of this happens in milliseconds, long before the reasoning parts of the brain have had a chance to evaluate what is actually happening. By the time you are consciously aware of your emotional reaction, it is already fully formed. The emotional conclusion has already been delivered. What the thinking mind does next is not independent analysis. It is, more often than not, justification. The emotional brain speaks first. The logical brain becomes its translator, finding reasons, constructing explanations, assembling evidence for a conclusion that was reached before any evidence was examined. The nervous system reacts before logic arrives, and by the time logic arrives, the verdict has already been rendered. This is why arguments feel so convincing in the middle of them and so hollow afterward. Why decisions made under emotional pressure so often look different in the morning. Why the story you tell yourself about a difficult situation in the first hours rarely matches the one you tell 6 months later. The emotion arrived first. The thinking was built around it. There is a range of emotional activation within which the mind can function with full access to its capacities. Inside that range, stress is manageable. Complexity can be held. Multiple perspectives can be considered at the same time. Outside that range, in states of high activation, thinking narrows. Options collapse. The future compresses into the immediate moment. Everything becomes more binary, more urgent, more certain than it actually is. This is not stupidity. It is a survival design. In a genuine physical emergency, fast, narrow thinking saves lives. You do not need to weigh 14 options when something is truly dangerous. You need one response immediately. But most of what activates the emotional system in modern life is not a physical emergency. It is ambiguity, perceived criticism, uncertainty about the future, a situation that feels like it might mean something bad, even when the evidence is thin. And narrow, fast thinking applied to ambiguous situations does not help. It distorts. It takes something complex and renders it falsely simple. It takes something uncertain and makes it feel falsely certain, almost always in the most threatening direction available. Urgency is not always truth. The feeling that something is critical right now is often the emotional system speaking, not reality confirming. Here is what this looks like in practice. Because naming the mechanism is useful, but recognizing it in real time is what actually changes things. When emotional activation is high, small things feel large. A slightly cool response from someone you care about feels like rejection. A professional setback feels like evidence of permanent inadequacy. An unresolved question feels like an approaching catastrophe. The distortion is not random. It follows the specific shapes of threat your nervous system has learned to be most sensitive to, shaped by your history, your experiences, the particular fears that have been reinforced over time. But the structure is the same for everyone. Something happens. The threat system activates. An emotional conclusion forms instantly, and the thinking that follows builds a case for that conclusion rather than examining it. The case always feels airtight, because the mind doesn't know it started from a conclusion. It experiences itself as reasoning toward one. This is the deepest difficulty of emotional reactivity. Not that it feels bad, that it feels true. The exit from this is not suppression. It is not the instruction to be more rational. Telling someone to think logically when their emotional system is fully activated is like asking someone to read the fine print while their house is on fire. The capacity for that kind of processing simply isn't available in that state. The exit is regulation, and regulation must come before thinking, not instead of it. This is a sequence that emotionally skilled people have learned, often without being able to articulate it explicitly. They do not think their way to calm. They create enough space, through a pause, through a breath, through a deliberate interruption, for the system to begin to settle. And then they think. The regulation doesn't need to be elaborate. It doesn't require a long practice or a special technique. It requires a pause, a moment between what happens and what you do about it. long enough to let the initial activation begin to ease, long enough for the reasoning mind to re-enter, not to avoid the response, not to suppress what is being felt, simply to ensure that what comes next comes from the thinking mind rather than the threat system. Reacting is not the same as responding. A reaction is immediate, automatic, driven by an emotional conclusion that formed before the thinking began. A response is deliberate. It may arrive at the same place, may say the same thing, take the same action, but it passes through the reasoning mind rather than around it. And that difference, invisible from the outside, changes its quality entirely. Emotionally skilled people are not people who feel less. They feel fully. What they have developed is a different relationship with feeling, one in which emotion is information rather than instruction. The pause is not passivity. It is precision. And that precision, accumulated over time across thousands of small moments, is what slowly changes the texture of a life. From reactive to deliberate, from driven by what happens to guided by how you choose to respond. That shift is available to you. It begins with a pause. In the next section, you will begin to work with regulation directly. What it actually looks like to regulate before responding, in the moments that make it most difficult, and why the people who do this consistently are not exceptional by nature, but simply trained by habit. Section 7. Regulating before responding. There is a version of you that already knows how to do this. Not perfectly, not consistently, but you have had moments, probably more than you remember, when something difficult happened and you did not immediately react. When you paused, even briefly, even without knowing why. When you let a beat of silence pass before speaking. When you stepped away from a situation and came back to it with a clarity you did not have in the first moment. Those moments were not accidents. They were glimpses of a capacity that already exists in you, one that has simply never been developed into a reliable, practiced skill. That is what this section is about. Not a new technique, not a system to memorize, but the deliberate cultivation of something you have already touched. First, a clarification that matters. Regulation is not calm. This is a common misunderstanding, that emotionally regulated people are simply calm people. That regulation means the absence of strong feeling, that the goal is some kind of serene emotional flatness. It is not. Regulation means something more precise. The ability to remain functional even under conditions that are pushing against you. To feel the activation, the anger, the anxiety, the fear, the frustration, without being completely taken over by it. To stay in contact with what is happening emotionally while retaining enough access to the reasoning mind to choose what comes next. Regulated people feel things fully. They are not emotionally muted. What they have developed is not the absence of feeling, but a different relationship with it. One in which emotion is information rather than instruction. The feeling arrives. It is felt, genuinely and completely. And then, before it becomes action, there's a pause. A moment of contact between the emotional experience and the thinking mind. That pause is regulation. Calm is not the absence of feeling. It is access. Access to the part of the mind that can think, choose, and respond. The pause doesn't arrive automatically. It is built. And it is built the same way any skill is built. Through repeated practice in conditions of gradually increasing difficulty, until what once required conscious effort becomes, over time, simply the way you move through things. But unlike most skills, the practice of regulation begins not in difficult moments, but in ordinary ones. This is where most people make their first mistake. They wait for a triggering situation and then attempt to regulate in the middle of it, which is approximately as effective as learning to swim for the first time in deep water. The conditions are wrong. The resources aren't available. The skill hasn't been built in easier conditions yet. Regulation is practiced first in stillness, in the ordinary moments between difficulty, in the small, unremarkable spaces of daily life where nothing is particularly threatening, because it is in those spaces that the nervous system learns, gradually, what settled actually feels like. When you know what settled feels like, the particular quality of it, the physical signature of a system that is not on alert, you can begin to recognize when you are moving away from it. And that recognition, arriving early enough, is the entry point for the pause. Here is what the practice looks like in its simplest form. In an ordinary moment, sitting, walking, in the transition between one task and another, simply noticing the current state of the nervous system, not analyzing it, not trying to change it, just noting, what is the quality of the thinking right now? Is the mind spacious or narrow, moving or circling, present or already somewhere else? This noticing, practiced regularly in low-stakes moments, develops into a capacity for noticing in high-stakes ones. The skill transfers, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. And in the moments that matter, when something pushes the nervous system toward its edges, the noticing arrives just quickly enough to create the pause. Just enough space between what happens and what you do about it to make a choice rather than execute a reaction. There is a physical dimension to this worth understanding, because regulation is not only something that happens in the mind, it happens in the body. The nervous system runs through the entire body. The activation that occurs during threat response is not just a mental experience, it is a physical one. Heart rate changes, breathing shallows, muscle tension increases, the body mobilizes, and regulation works, most reliably, through the body as well as the mind. This is why certain physical shifts, slower, deeper breathing, deliberate relaxation of the jaw, the shoulders, the hands, a change of physical position or environment, can alter the nervous system's state in ways that thinking alone cannot. They speak the body's language. They send signals through the same pathways the threat response uses. The most effective of these is also the simplest. A longer exhale than inhale. This activates the part of the nervous system responsible for rest and recovery, measurably, physiologically, in a way that creates a small opening in the activation. A moment where the thinking mind can re-enter. Not a breathing exercise. A simple, quiet interruption. A use of the body's own system to create the conditions in which a pause becomes possible. In practice, regulation is rarely elegant. It does not look the way it sounds when described. It is not a serene pause, a graceful breath, a composed moment of reflection. In real conditions, in the middle of a difficult conversation, in the first moments after something goes wrong, in the quiet of 3 in the morning when a fear returns, it is messier than that. A pause that feels forced, a breath that feels inadequate, a moment of stepping back that feels more like retreat than skill. And it works anyway, because even an imperfect pause creates more space than no pause at all. Even a shallow breath changes the trajectory of the nervous system slightly. Even a few seconds between stimulus and response can be enough to prevent the reaction that would have made everything harder. The goal is not perfection. The goal is interruption, the consistent practice of inserting something, anything, between what happens and what you do next. Over time, that insertion becomes natural. The pause that once required enormous effort begins to arrive on its own. Not always, not in every situation, but often enough, and in enough of the situations that matter, to change the quality of what follows. The most effective thinkers are not the fastest. They are not the most eloquent or the most certain. They are the most regulated. Not because regulation makes them feel less, but because it keeps the mind open in conditions that would otherwise close it. Because it preserves access to the kind of thinking, wide, considered, genuinely solution-oriented, that difficult situations actually require. You already have this capacity. What you are building now is not something new. It is a more reliable relationship with something you have always had. One that has appeared in your best moments, your most considered decisions, your quietest acts of genuine clarity. The work is simply to make those moments less accidental, more practiced, more available, more yours. In the next section, you will begin to understand attention, not as something you have, but as something you are constantly training, whether you intend to or not, and what becomes possible when that training finally becomes deliberate. Section 8. Training your attention. You are training your attention right now, not intentionally, not as part of a practice or a plan, but in every moment, in the way you move through your day, in what you reach for when nothing is demanding your focus, In the mental habits so automatic you stopped noticing them years ago, your attention is being shaped. The question is not whether you are training it. You always are. The question is what, exactly, you are training it toward. Attention is not a passive receiver. We tend to think of it as something we point at the world, something neutral that collects what is there and returns with an accurate picture of reality. It is not neutral. It is selective, radically, consequentially selective. Of the enormous volume of information available to your senses and your mind at any given moment, attention filters out the vast majority and brings forward a small, curated portion. And what that portion contains is not determined by what is most true, or most important, or most useful. It is determined by what your attention has been trained to look for. A mind trained by years of worry will find things to worry about, not because the world is unusually threatening, but because that is what the filter has been calibrated to surface. A mind trained toward possibility will find possibility in the same circumstances, with the same objective facts, looking at the same life. This is not optimism. It is simply how trained attention works. What you train your attention toward determines what your life feels like from the inside. The training happens in the small moments, not the large ones. This is where most people misunderstand how attention changes and why efforts to redirect it so often fail. They wait for a difficult moment and attempt, in that moment, to think differently, to not look at the fear, to focus on solutions instead of problems. This rarely works, not because the intention is wrong, because the timing is wrong. Attention is trained in the ordinary moments. In the transition between tasks, what does the mind reach for? In a quiet moment with nothing pressing, where does it go? In 30 seconds of stillness, does it rest or does it scan? These small movements of attention are where the habit lives, and they are almost entirely automatic, below the level of conscious awareness, running on patterns established so long ago that they feel like personality rather than habit. Bringing gentle awareness to these small movements is the beginning of training, not changing them immediately, not forcing attention somewhere different, simply noticing where it goes on its own, with curiosity, without judgment, without pressure. That noticing creates a small gap between the automatic movement and the next moment. And in that gap, choice becomes possible. You have used this capacity before. Every time you caught yourself daydreaming and gently came back. Every time you noticed your mind wandering and returned without drama. Every time you stepped back from a reaction and recognized it as a reaction, rather than simply acting on it. Those moments of noticing are this capacity in action, the ability to observe your own thinking without being identical to it, to watch the mind without being carried automatically in whatever direction it moves, to notice the thought without becoming the thought. What changes with deliberate practice is not whether this capacity exists. It already exists in you. What changes is its reliability, its speed, the point at which it arrives, earlier and earlier in the sequence, until it is present almost at the moment the automatic movement begins, rather than long after it has already taken hold. Solution-focused thinking is, at its core, an attention practice. It does not change what problems exist in your life. It changes where attention goes once a problem has been registered, and therefore what the mind finds, what options it surfaces, what emotional state it generates as it works. The practice looks like this. When a problem surfaces, and the mind moves, automatically, toward its worst dimensions, its most threatening implications, the practice is to notice that movement, and then to ask one simple redirecting question. What is one thing within reach? Not the full solution, not the resolution of everything at once, just the next honest step, the smallest available movement from where you are right now. This question doesn't always produce a satisfying answer. Sometimes the step is smaller than feels adequate. Sometimes the direction is uncertain even after asking. But the asking itself changes where attention points. And where attention points changes what the mind finds. And what the mind finds changes the signal the nervous system receives. A little less threatening, a little more spacious, a little more open to the next moment of clear thinking. This is how the practice compounds. Not in dramatic leaps. In the quiet accumulation of redirected moments. each one small, each one imperfect, each one building something real. Your attention is the most powerful thing you have, not your intelligence, not your willpower, not your circumstances or your resources or the particular details of your situation. Where your attention goes, what it finds, how it moves, determines the quality of your experience more than any external factor. It determines what problems feel like, what possibilities look like, what you are capable of in the moments that matter most. And it is trainable, not through force, not through discipline alone, but through the gentle, consistent, patient practice of noticing, and then, one moment at a time, choosing. That choice, practiced daily in the small moments that feel too minor to matter, is what changes the mind over time. Not dramatically, not all at once, but genuinely, and in a way that lasts. In the next section, you will begin to see how these practices, regulation, attention training, solution-focused orientation, are not just techniques to apply in difficult moments. They are the foundation of a different identity, a different way of being someone in the world. And understanding how that identity is built is what makes the change feel possible for the first time. Section 9. The identity of a calm thinker. At some point in this audiobook, something may have shifted slightly. Not dramatically, not in the way transformations are described in stories, sudden, complete, unmistakable, but quietly. A small loosening of something that had been held tightly for a long time. A moment of recognition that felt different from the ones before it. A thought that arrived and, instead of spiraling, simply settled. If that happened, even once, even briefly, you have already begun. Because identity does not change in dramatic moments. It changes in small ones. In the accumulation of micro-experiences that the mind uses, slowly and mostly without awareness, to update its answer to the question it is always quietly asking. Who am I when things get difficult? Most people have never examined the answer they are currently living with. It arrived gradually, assembled from experiences that felt defining at the time, moments of being overwhelmed, reacting in ways that were later regretted, finding themselves back in the same loop for what felt like the 100th time. From those experiences, and from the stories built around them, an identity formed. Someone who struggles with this. Someone who gets anxious about that. Someone who overthinks. Someone who can't quite stay calm when it matters most. These identities are not malicious constructions. They are the mind doing what minds do, finding patterns in experience and building a coherent sense of self around them. The problem is that once a self-concept forms, it begins to operate as a filter, selecting for experiences that confirm it, interpreting ambiguous situations in its direction. The person who believes they cannot stay calm under pressure will find, in every pressured situation, evidence that they cannot stay calm. Not because they are right, but because they are looking for confirmation, and the mind, as you now know, finds what it searches for. This is not a fixed condition. It is a trainable one. Identity is not who you are. It is what you practice. This is not a motivational reframe. It is a description of how self-concept actually works. The brain builds its model of the self from repeated experience. Patterns of behavior that occur consistently across time become, gradually, part of the substrate of identity, which means that identity is not changed by insight alone. It is changed by repeated experience of being someone slightly different, in small moments, in ordinary situations, in the unremarkable daily decisions that feel too minor to matter. Every time you notice the loop before it fully takes hold, that is a deposit. Every time you regulate before reacting, that is a deposit. Every time you ask what is within reach instead of circling what is unresolved, that is a deposit. None of these moments feel significant in themselves. They do not announce themselves as turning points. They feel like small choices in ordinary moments, almost too small to count. But the mind is counting. The nervous system is registering. Somewhere below the level of conscious awareness, a different pattern is being laid down. A different answer forming, slowly, to the question that has always been there. Who am I when things get difficult? There is a particular quality that calm thinkers share, and it is almost always misidentified from the outside. It is not the absence of feeling. Calm thinkers are not people who care less, feel less, or are less affected by difficulty than others. In many cases, the opposite is true. The development of regulation creates more capacity for genuine feeling, not less, because the emotional experience no longer needs to be immediately managed through reaction. It is not certainty about outcomes. Calm thinkers do not know things will work out. They are not more certain about the future than anyone else. What they have is something more useful than certainty, a quiet trust in their own capacity to meet whatever arrives. Not to control it, not to predict it, but to meet it from a regulated place with a mind that can actually think. And it is not the absence of struggle. Calm thinkers face difficulty, loss, uncertainty, and failure, the same raw material of human experience that everyone navigates. What is different is not the circumstances. It is the relationship to them. The identity of a calm thinker is built in the moments between the difficult ones. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about this kind of change. You do not build it by performing calm in crisis. You build it in the transitions. In the ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when nothing is particularly wrong and the mind reaches, out of habit, for something to worry about, and you notice that reach and gently redirect. In the conversation that begins to activate the threat response, and you feel the activation, name it quietly, and take one breath before speaking. In the moment of uncertainty that would previously have opened into a loop, and instead opens into a question, what is one thing within reach? These moments are not glamorous. They will not become stories you tell. No one will witness them or validate them or reflect back to you that something is changing. But something is changing, quietly, incrementally, in the way that all genuine change actually happens. Not in the dramatic moments that feel like turning points, but in the ordinary ones that were actually building something the whole time. You do not need to become someone else. The qualities that make you sensitive to difficulty, that make you feel things deeply, that made you reach for this audiobook at all, these are not liabilities to overcome. They are the same qualities that make genuine emotional intelligence possible. The same attunement that produces anxiety, when directed deliberately, produces extraordinary perceptiveness. The same depth that produces rumination, when given a direction, produces genuine insight. The work is not to replace what you are. It is to train it. To take the mind you already have, with its sensitivity, its depth, its strong emotional responses, and give it the skills it was never given before. Regulation, attentional direction, the practiced habit of moving toward what is possible rather than circling what is not. The result is not a different person. It is a more skillful version of the one you already are. Calm, deliberate, grounded under pressure, not because the pressure has gone, but because you have become someone who knows how to meet it. In the next section, you will encounter the final reframe, the one that changes not just how you think about problems, but what problems actually are. Not threats, not evidence of failure, something quieter and far more useful than either. Section 10. Problems as information, not attacks. There is a way of meeting a problem that most people never try, not because it is difficult, not because it requires special training or unusual intelligence, but because it runs so counter to the automatic response that it rarely even occurs as an option. It is this, meeting the problem as if it were simply information, not a threat, not an attack on a life that should be going differently, not evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with you, your choices, or your circumstances. Just a signal, something this situation is communicating that, if received clearly, might actually tell you something useful. This reframe sounds simple. Its implications are not. Think about the way a problem typically arrives. There is the event itself, the thing that happens, the gap between expectation and reality, the plan that fails, the relationship that fractures, the result that doesn't come. That is the raw material, a fact. And then, almost simultaneously, there is the interpretation. This shouldn't be happening. This means something bad. This is evidence of something, about me, about the future, about whether things are going to be okay. That interpretation arrives so quickly and feels so self-evidently correct that most people never notice it as an interpretation at all. It feels like perception, like simply seeing what is there. but it is not perception. It is a story assembled automatically in milliseconds by a nervous system calibrated to treat unresolved situations as danger. And like all stories, it can be examined, questioned, told differently. Problems are not attacks. They are information. This is not a positive spin on difficulty. It is a more accurate description of what problems actually are and what they are actually for. Every problem contains within it something the current situation is communicating. A plan that failed is communicating something about the plan, about an assumption that was wrong, a variable that was underestimated, a direction that needs adjusting. A relationship under strain is communicating something about unmet needs, unspoken expectations, or a dynamic that has quietly drifted. A result that didn't arrive is communicating something about the gap between effort and outcome. None of this information is comfortable. Receiving it clearly requires a degree of honesty that the emotional response, the threat activation, the urgent need to make the problem mean something manageable, actively works against. But the information is there. A mind that can receive it clearly, without the distortion of threat response, without the noise of emotional urgency, is a mind that can actually use it. This is the difference between a problem that teaches you something and a problem that simply exhausts you. The problem is the same. The receiver is different. There is a quality that solution-focused thinkers develop over time that is difficult to name precisely, but unmistakable once you begin to recognize it. A kind of curiosity about difficulty, not performed curiosity, not the forced reframe of someone trying very hard to see the bright side of something genuinely painful, but a genuine, grounded interest in what the situation is communicating, what it is revealing, what it is pointing toward, what it might be asking for. This curiosity does not require pretending that difficulty is welcome, or that painful things don't hurt, or that there is always a lesson that makes the experience worthwhile. It simply asks, what is here if I look clearly? That question, asked from a regulated state, with a mind that has learned to face toward possibility rather than circling threat, changes what the problem reveals. Not because the problem changes, but because the quality of attention brought to it changes what is found. A problem examined with curiosity yields information. A problem examined with anxiety yields more anxiety. The problem is the same. The examination determines what comes next. When a problem is a threat, the only acceptable response is full resolution, making it go away, making it stop, making it no longer a problem. Anything short of that feels like failure. And because many problems cannot be fully resolved immediately, the gap between the current situation and complete resolution becomes its own source of distress. The problem is difficult. The fact that it isn't fixed yet is also difficult. The uncertainty about when it will be fixed is also difficult. The threat frame multiplies the problem. When a problem is information, the response changes entirely. Information does not need to be eliminated. It needs to be understood and then acted upon, partially, imperfectly, in the direction of what is possible from where you are right now. A small response to accurate information is more useful than paralysis in the face of an overwhelming threat. This is why solution-focused thinking produces movement, where problem-focused thinking produces loops. Not because the problems are easier, but because the frame opens options that the threat frame closes. Because a mind meeting information can engage with it. A mind meeting an attack can only defend against it. You cannot think clearly through a problem you are treating as an assault on your life. But you can engage thoughtfully, honestly, and deliberately with information, even when that information is uncomfortable, even when the situation it describes is genuinely difficult. Problems are not asking you to be unaffected. They are asking you to be clear. Clarity, in this context, does not mean certainty. It does not mean knowing exactly what to do or how things will unfold. It means seeing the situation as accurately as possible, without the inflation of threat response, without the distortion of emotional urgency, without the narrowing that comes from treating every unresolved thing as a crisis. Clarity is what becomes available when the nervous system is settled, when attention is directed deliberately, and when the mind has learned to meet difficulty with curiosity rather than defense. It comes and goes. It is not a permanent state. It arrives more available on some days than others, in some situations than others. But it comes more often and stays longer the more consistently it is practiced. And each time it arrives, each time a problem is met as information rather than attack, each time curiosity replaces defense, each time the mind moves toward what is possible rather than circling what is threatening, something is reinforced. Not just a skill, an identity. The identity of someone who meets difficulty clearly, who wastes nothing, who has learned that problems are not the enemy of a good life. They are part of what makes a good life navigable. The ongoing feedback between where you are and where you are going. A mind that can receive that communication clearly is not a mind that suffers less. It is a mind that uses everything. In the final section, you will arrive at the place this entire audiobook has been moving toward. Not a conclusion, but a beginning. The quiet, grounded recognition of what becomes possible when the mind has been trained to meet the world differently. Section 11. The quiet power of a trained mind. You don't need a different life to think differently. This is the thing most people spend years waiting to discover, that the circumstances need to change first, that the situation needs to resolve, the pressure needs to lift, the uncertainty needs to clear. That clarity is something that arrives from the outside, once things are finally easier. It isn't. Clarity is built from the inside, slowly, quietly, in the ordinary moments that never felt like they mattered, in the pause before the reaction, in the breath before the response, in the small, unhurried question, what is one thing within reach? That is where the trained mind is built, not in the dramatic moments, in the invisible ones. What you have encountered in this audiobook is not a collection of techniques to apply when things get hard. It is something more fundamental, an understanding of how the mind actually works when it is under pressure, and what becomes possible when that understanding is lived rather than simply known. You have seen why the nervous system mistakes uncertainty for danger, and why that ancient response, unchanged across thousands of years, is creating exhaustion in a world it was never designed for. You have seen how emotional activation distorts thinking, not as a flaw, but as a feature of a system built for immediate physical threats, now running in a world of abstract, ongoing uncertainty. You have seen how the mind can become attached to its own problems, how familiarity masquerades as safety, how identity can organize itself around struggle, and how that pull, once understood, begins to lose its grip. You have seen how attention is trained, continuously, automatically, whether you intend it or not, and what becomes possible when that training becomes deliberate. And you have seen, perhaps most importantly, that the identity of a calm thinker is not a personality type you either have or don't. It is a practice, a repeated choice, a slowly accumulating body of experience that the mind uses, over time, to answer differently the question it has always been asking. Who am I when things get difficult? The answer you are building, quietly, in the small moments, is this: someone who pauses before reacting, someone who regulates before responding, someone who meets problems as information rather than attacks, someone whose attention moves, gradually and with practice, toward what is possible rather than circling what is not. Not perfectly, not in every moment, not without occasional returns to old patterns, because old patterns don't disappear. They simply become less automatic, less inevitable, less the only available response. The trained mind is not an invulnerable mind. It is a mind that has developed a different relationship with its own vulnerability, one that can feel the activation without being taken over by it, that can sit with uncertainty without treating it as emergency, that can face difficulty with the quiet steadiness of someone who knows, not that everything will be fine, but that they have somewhere to go. And that knowing is enough. It is more than enough. There is something worth saying about what this change actually feels like, because it rarely feels the way transformation is supposed to feel. It does not arrive with clarity and fanfare. It does not announce itself. There is no single moment when you wake up and know, with certainty, that something has fundamentally shifted. The change is quieter than that, more gradual, more like the slow turning of a ship than the sudden swerving of a car. You notice it first in the small things. A situation that would have sent you into a loop and didn't quite. A conversation that would have activated the threat response, and you caught it just early enough, just barely. A moment of uncertainty that would have felt like emergency, and instead felt, for a few seconds at least, like information. These moments will not feel significant when they happen. They will feel ordinary, almost unremarkable. And that is precisely the point, because ordinary is where the change lives. Not in the peak experiences, in the texture of daily life, slowly becoming something different, a little less reactive, a little more grounded, a little more yours. There is a kind of power that does not announce itself. It does not look impressive from the outside. It does not perform. It does not make noise or demand recognition or require an audience to validate it. It simply produces better decisions, clearer thinking, more genuine presence in the moments that actually matter. A life that feels, over time, less like something happening to you and more like something you are genuinely participating in. This is the quiet power the title of this audiobook points toward. Not loudness, not force, not the aggressive certainty of someone who has convinced themselves everything will work out. The power of a mind that thinks clearly when thinking clearly is most difficult. That stays grounded when the pressure to react is highest. That moves deliberately when everything around it is pushing toward urgency. Calm is not weakness. It is access. Access to the kind of thinking, wide, honest, solution-oriented, that difficult situations actually require. Access to the version of yourself that was always capable of this and simply needed the right conditions to emerge. You don't need to become someone else to access it. You need to train the mind you already have. The sensitivity that made you feel things so deeply, that is not a liability. It is the same quality that will make your emotional intelligence profound once it is paired with regulation. The depth that led you into rumination, that is not a flaw. It is the same quality that will produce genuine insight once it is given a direction. The attunement that made you so responsive to uncertainty, that is not weakness. It is the same quality that will make you extraordinarily perceptive once the nervous system learns to distinguish uncertainty from danger. Nothing needs to be discarded. Everything needs to be trained. People sometimes ask what solution-focused thinking looks like in practice, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. What does it actually feel like, day to day, when this way of meeting the world begins to take hold? It feels like this. A problem arrives, as problems always do, without warning, without asking permission. And the mind, instead of immediately contracting around it, pauses. Not dramatically, not with effort that anyone else would notice. Just a beat, a breath, a moment of contact before the reaction. And in that moment, a question forms. Not, why is this happening to me? Not, what does this mean about my life? Not, how bad could this get? But, what is here if I look clearly? What does this situation actually need? What is one honest step from where I am right now? And the mind, trained gradually, over many small moments just like this one, begins to move. Not with certainty, not with a guarantee that everything will resolve, but with direction, with the quiet confidence of a mind that has learned it does not need to know the ending to take the next step. That is what solution-focused thinking feels like when it becomes real. Not a technique you apply, a way the mind has learned to move. And that training, quiet, patient, cumulative, has already begun. Not in some future version of your life when things are easier. Not when the circumstances finally cooperate. Not when you feel ready, because the feeling of readiness is itself a trained state. One that arrives through practice, not before it. Here, in this moment, in the simple act of having listened, of staying with difficult ideas long enough to let them land, of choosing, even today, even in one small moment, to pause before reacting, to regulate before responding, to meet what comes with a mind that is clearer than it was before. That is the beginning, not a dramatic beginning, a quiet one, but the quiet ones are the ones that last. A tired mind does not think clearly. A trained mind, your mind, with practice, does. And it already has. More than you realize. More than you have given yourself credit for. The work continues. The direction is clear. And you already know how to take the next step.